Hi, this is Ron with Mobile Fix Automotive again, and I'm going to shoot a video today on a 2004 Toyota Tundra 4.7 liter V8. We're going to be installing, or I am going to be installing, the tensioner assembly for the main fan belt. And this particular customer complaint is a chirping, squealing when the vehicle's cold. So the belt tension on this is very weak. So since everything's lined up and the belt's not shredding, tensioner is going to be the first thing I'm going to change. But the way Toyota set this up, as great as these engines are, and they're great engines, the tensioner is not an easy one to change. It's not a simple one like the Chevrolets have. So there's going to be a lot of stuff coming off of this, but it's not that bad of a job. Most of you do-it-yourselfers should be able to tackle this. So let me start you out with the tooling that I'm going to use. You may or may not have any of this. This job can be done with hand wrenches and ratchets, but for time and because I'm a professional, I'm going to be using electrics. But the things I'm going to use are basically this rack here. There's going to be a pry bar. It's mainly going to be for the fan assembly. You'll see long standard screwdriver. You can use a short one. This is just basically to help get the hoses off if they stick. I'm going to be using a pair of pliers to get the clamps off of the hoses. I am going to be using a 12 millimeter wobbly socket, a 14 millimeter deep socket, 3/8 drive, a 10, 12, and 14 millimeter hand wrench. And then the trick to this for me, you can do this a couple of different ways. I'm going to do it my shortcut way, which is get yourself an E8 inverted Torx. It's basically just a female Torx, and see, will that zoom in and stay focused? So it's basically just a star head is basically what it is. This is going to be to pull a stud on the power steering pump is what this is going to be for. So it's an E8 in size. You can get these at Kragen or any of the stores, the places that sell the inexpensive tools. Basic small pocket screwdriver I use, 10 millimeter deep, and then I use a 3/8 inch drive extension, and then I'm going to use a pair of hose pliers. This is actually going to be for the transmission cooler lines because sometimes they stick. And then I'm going to be using 2 ratchets instead of air today. I'm going to be using electric. I've got a 3/8 ratchet, and I've got a 1/4 inch ratchet with a 10 millimeter wobbly already on it, and then a 3/8 drive electric gun. So these are the tools with a 12 millimeter deep. These are the tools I'm going to be using. The part that I'm going to be changing is this piece right here in question. This is the drive belt tensioner assembly, and when I say drive belt, I am not talking about the timing belt assembly. I'm talking about the main drive belt that drives the alternator, power steering, air conditioning, pretty much runs everything around the front outside of the engine. This tensioner just doesn't have a whole lot of spring load to it anymore, so this is what we're going to be replacing. But if you look in here, you'll see that there's a ridge, and there's a bunch of stuff that goes around this. It all has to be pulled off. I want to thank Rick, is my friend of mine and a customer. He's the one that owns this truck, and he's been gracious enough to leave it long enough for me to be able to shoot this video to help you guys out. Now, I looked this up on YouTube because my Mitchell On Demand system, which is the professional operating system that I use to look up repairs, procedures, and estimating, gave me 3.5 hours to do this. But they did not give me the procedure for doing this. So I started looking it up on YouTube, and I didn't find any decent videos that really helped me out. So now I'm going to shoot one, hopefully that'll help you out. So what we're going to do right now is the cooling system. I'm going to be pulling the radiator on this to help. Not only it makes it easier on me, but it's going to help you guys be able to see what I'm doing. This job can be done without pulling the radiator, with just pulling the fan and the fan shroud. It would just be a little bit tighter and a little bit more difficult. Pulling the radiator really isn't that hard. You're going to see it's only going to take a few minutes from start to finish. So the only thing that I've done ahead of time on this, other than already doing it once and then putting it back together to help shoot this video, is the coolant. The coolant is already out of the truck. It takes so long to drain and get everything drained, I didn't fill it back up during reassembly. So the old part is still in the truck. Everything's been put back together, and we're going to do this bolt by bolt. And we're going to shoot this video raw, so if I make a mistake, stay tuned to the very end of the video and I'll do the corrections at the end. All right, so at this point, I'm going to have my lovely assistant camera lady, which is my wife. I think this is the second video she shot with me. I'm going to have her pause it. We're going to put this up in the air and we're going to start pulling stuff apart on the bottom first. So, you want to pause that? All right, so now the vehicle's up in the air. What we're going to be doing is, like I said, we're pulling the radiator. So most of these trucks will have a skid plate on it. The skid plates are going to be held in with 5 bolts that are 12 millimeter heads. So this is why the 12 millimeters on the 3/8 gun. Now, these skid plates have a hook on each side in the front. So when you pull the bolts, they're not going to fall down right away. Okay, so those are the rear 3, and then there's one. I want to show them where this one's at in case they can't find it. These are the two hidden ones. There's one on each side in the back. So, and pull that, and then this thing should just hang. Now, there's no bolts holding it in right now. It's actually hanging on those 2 hangers. I don't know if the video is going to be able to get the hangers, but what you're going to do is you're going to take this thing, push it forward and up. You see can you focus in on the hooks right here that are on the top? See the 2 hooks? There's one on each side. Those are what hold it in place. So you literally just lift it up and wiggle it and it'll come off. And then we just set this out of the way. Right on my foot. Now it's a good point at this particular point in time. The drain for your radiator, if you choose to do it the way I'm doing it and pull your radiator, your drain is usually right here on a factory Toyota. This is the original radiator, so it hasn't been replaced. So you're going to take the radiator cap off, and then you take the radiator cap off so that there's no vacuum holding it in. It'll drain faster. You can unscrew this. You notice I have a big bucket underneath. Let's pretend that I've screwed this off and I've spent 5 or 10 minutes waiting for all the coolant to drip out. When the coolant's gone, here's what you need to do. Get yourself a big pair of pliers. You can use multiple different types. This is the type I use. See if you can come on in here close. So there's 3 things we're going to be doing. The first clamp, this is a factory Toyota clamp, is the lower radiator hose. The second clamp is transmission cooler line. And the third clamp is transmission cooler line. Stay right where you're at. So when you take off the transmission cooler lines, I'm using my special little pliers for hoses. It breaks the seal, and then you just simply pull it back, wiggle it back. Now, you're going to end up with oil dripping just like we are. That's why you have a pan on the ground. Get my rag. And then I'm going to break this one loose. If these hoses are extremely old, they can be kind of a bear to get off, but you can stick a bolt in them. You could use a clamp on them, but they'll stop dripping after a couple of minutes. They don't drain the transmission at all, so you don't have to worry about it. And then this one here, which is the lower radiator hose, I've already drained the radiator and pulled it. Sometimes when you go to take this off, you will get fluid to come out of it again, even though you drained it. That's perfectly normal. In this particular event, it's already drained. So now that that's done and we're disconnected on the bottom, now we're going to put the vehicle back down and everything else will be done from the top. We won't have to go back underneath the vehicle again. So instead of watching the boring setting down of the vehicle, why don't you go ahead and pause that and we'll put this. Okay, so now the vehicle's back on the ground. The very first thing I'm going to do, especially because I'm going to be removing the alternator on this vehicle, is we're going to disconnect the negative battery cable. Now, this car is still original, so it's a 10 millimeter. And we're going to disconnect the negative. And I'm going to explain something to people that are kind of relatively new to this, that don't understand a lot of the complexities. The reason why I do the negative and not the positive is actually a very interesting and common sense deal when you think about it. If I accidentally touch the negative to ground, it's not going to throw a spark because negative and negative is negative. It's this, I'm basically just making the same connection. However, if I was to put a wrench on the positive and spin it and it was to hit something metal, that's when we call letting the smoke out, but it'll cause a big spark and it can cause some damage. So you always try to do the negative when you disconnect a battery. Always disconnect the negative first and connect the negative last. That way, if there's a problem, you don't cause a short. Anyway, there's useless information for you. Hopefully that'll come in handy later on down the line and somebody won't fry something. Okay, so the battery's disconnected, so now there's no way of us having any short underneath the hood unless somebody installed a second battery, and you know, that's happened before. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the air intake system, the cover for the air intake system, not necessarily in that order. The things I'd like my wife to focus on is the air intake has 3 hoses on it that need to be disconnected. Pinch this, they do a great job of giving you these long arms so you don't have to use a pair of pliers. Pinch the little clamp, break the seal. Be careful not to break the little plastic nipple off of the housing. But you've got this connector, you've got a tiny little vacuum hose right here. Can you see that? You should just disconnect that and then disconnect the larger hose. Don't have to worry about marking these because they're all 3 different sizes. I'm not going to say you can't get it wrong, but you'd have to be really talented to get it wrong. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my 3-inch extension on my 3/8 impact or air ratchet, actually electric ratchet. So this is my setup. I'm going to put it in the off position. The 2 nuts that hold the little beauty cover on. I need my magnet tray, which makes things really easy on me. So we're going to pull this off and we're going to set this aside. That gives us access into here. And now there's a bolt right here for the air conditioning hose. On this particular vehicle, it's 10 millimeter. In head size, and then that disconnects that hose. You can just let this thing swivel around, and then you can use a couple of different tools, screwdrivers or whatever you want, but there's a clamp right here for the air intake snorkel, and then there's a, if you want to go back, I think I went too fast for you, there's a clamp right here. What we're going to do is we're going to wiggle this and pull that off, and then we're going to carefully turn it and lift it, and it'll pop this assembly out. That's your air intake hose. Okay, we're just going to set that up out of the way. Now, for those of us professional guys that should be doing this right, we're going to find a nice clean rag with no debris in it, and we're going to shove it right inside this air intake hole. Because that's the last place you want to see anything fall, even though there's a throttle plate in there that theoretically shouldn't work. Now, if you take this and you turn it upside down, nothing's going to fall into it other than over there, and we're really not going to be worried about dropping anything from that distance, so we're fine. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to be pulling the upper radiator hose and the radiator overflow hose. Now this little thing right here likes to get in the way. If you tuck it, sometimes it'll pop back out, but just find a place to put it where it'll be happy. And then my pair of pliers, we're going to take this clamp off here, twist, wiggle carefully. We're dealing with a plastic radiator. I'm going to put this basically up back in here. I'm just tucking it so that the clamp grabs onto this hose. It'll hold it in place while we pull the rest of this out. Now, there's one piece that I forgot to do from the bottom. So, my bad. We're going to pause and go back up into the air because I can't pull the fan shroud until I do it. And you're going to have to walk under here and look. think we had a technical glitch there, but we're back. So basically what I did wrong was there's one stage I forgot to do. I call it the smiley face, but on a Toyota, I'm going to kick this out of the way because it's not going to leak on me anymore. If you look up in here, see this piece right here? And I'm getting dripped on by the transmission cooler line, but this piece right here is called the smiley face. That's what I call it. Okay? There's a clip right here. You put a screwdriver in there and lift out and just, it'll pop. You don't even need a screwdriver. You can actually use your finger. There's one on the inside that you have to pull with your finger too. And it just fell on the ground. And that happens too. That's okay. It's not broken. It just popped off. So at the bottom of this, once those two clips are off, there's one on each side. See that there's a piece right here that goes in. It's just a lip, just a retainer. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pull up and out on both sides. And then this is the reason I call it the smiley face. If the job was really hard, nah, it's not joke around. All right, so now I need to put this clip that fell off back on, and just to show you that it's no big deal, it just fits on just like this one. So it only goes on, you can put it on two different ways, but it only goes on one side because there's no hole in the metal clip. So for what it's worth, there's the smiley face. Now we'll pause again to not bore you to death and put it back down and finish up. Okay, so now we're back to where we were. Now what I'm going to need is my ratchet. You can do this with any kind of hand tools. It can just take a little bit longer. I'm going to use a 10mm wobbly, and if my wife would like to look in here, this is the fan shroud that we're going to pull. This is what we just took the smiley face off of. On the side of this fan shroud, there's a bolt here and a bolt down there. So there's two bolts on each side. They're very easy to find. So if you want, you can watch me pull this one. Okay, I'm going to put that over there. And then I'm going to go down in here with the ratchet on the bottom one. And usually this one, I'm going to have to put my arm down in here. Hopefully not get in your way too bad. Usually this one's the one that falls off inside your bucket full of oil and water, and you have to clean it. So we got that one off. And then that one off. And then that one off, and then move your air conditioning hose out of the way. And basically what the smiley face did was it opened up this area so that you could slide this out with the fan in place. Even if you don't remove the radiator to do this job, you still have to pull this because you've got to get the fan off. So we're going to set this out of the way. And now what we have is a completely disconnected radiator, and we got 4 bolts before it comes out. So see how quick this is for pulling the radiator? So come around here real quick and let me show them with my little pointy stick. The bolts for this radiator, they should be, as long as they haven't been tampered with, they should be a 12mm. Most all of them are. So there's 4 of them. One of them is right here. One of them is right down here. See that one? Okay. So we got that one, which is the first one I just showed you, right there. And then on the other side of the radiator are 2 more. That one right there, and then this one down here. Okay, and basically what I use to pull those is I use a 12mm wobbly. Now, if you have an aftermarket radiator in your vehicle, sometimes they do not have these little, come on, you're going to need to be close to me. Because I found this out the hard way one time and it dropped the radiator on the ground and I wasn't happy about it. If you do not see these, can you see that little clip? Right there?
Light's bright.
Okay, let me see if I can turn it off. Does that make it better?
Yeah.
Okay, so this little clip, there should be one of those on each side of the radiator. The other one's right there. Those are on the radiator housing, and that's what keeps the radiator from falling through the vehicle when you take the 4 bolts out. If you do not see those little bitty tangs sticking through that hole, that means you got an aftermarket radiator that didn't come with it, probably a Kragen or an AutoZone radiator, and because the high-end quality ones will always have those. But if you don't see those sticking through there, you're going to have somebody or yourself hold the radiator when you pull the bolt so it doesn't fall through. In this particular case, it has them. We're not going to have a problem. So, you want to videotape any of this instead of showing my face? Basically, I'm just taking these bolts out. That way they can see what I'm doing. Gotta get the wobbly socket lined up on this one. Wow, it tightened that one down. When I put that back in, it actually tightened it tighter than it should have. Okay, so we're going to take these 2 bolts and put these bolts aside. Now you'll notice in my magnet tray how I group my nuts and bolts. So this group right here went to the plate. This group right here is for the radiator. This group was for the radiator fan shroud. Okay, so now all you have to do is grab the radiator and pull upwards on it carefully and pull it out, and there's your radiator. And these are those little, can you see these pieces? Mm-hmm. These are those little pieces I told you, they go into the hole and they hold the radiator when you, so you can put the bolts in and take them back out. So I'm going to carefully lean this up against, actually turn it around so it doesn't leak all over the ground when it's leaned over. And lean that right up against that box, just like that. Okay, so now we're getting closer to the piece we're going in after. And the next step we're going to do is we're going to take the fan off the engine. The fan is held on, ideally, it should be held on by 4 nuts that are 12 millimeter. A lot of times when you go to undo these nuts, see how it turns you can't get a grip on it, it won't break loose. If you take a pry bar or a screwdriver and wedge it in next to the bolts before or after it, you can break them loose. That one's broke loose now. That one's broke loose now. And that one's broke loose now. Let me see if I can get the bottom one to break loose without having to use a pry bar. Nope. So I'll just put this underneath the nut to hold that still. There we go. Now I don't need the pry bar anymore because the nuts are all loose. So you're just gonna, hopefully they'll be as easy as these and they just spin right off. You can use your fingers. Start a new group of nuts and bolts over here. All right. Okay. So the bottom one is going to have to come out a little ways before it'll break loose by hand or spin by hand, just because there's going to be a little bit of tension from the belt. That's normal, but it's okay to pull this off with the belt on it. So now I'm going to get the top one off. The bottom nut's still on. I'm just trying to make this as easy for me as possible. Okay, so there's 3 of the nuts.
And the bottom one, which still has enough tension on it that I can't spin it off by hand, I'm just rotating it as much as I can. And then at some point it will let go. All right. I think I'm going to drop this one. Yep, I dropped it, but I only dropped it, it landed on the fan belt. So we're going to pull the fan off, and we're going to set the fan carefully out of the way. Don't drop it, you don't want to break the plastic fan blades. And then I need to get the nut that fell. So the 4 nuts that hold that are on there. Now, you can do, I'm going to do this my way, you guys can do it backwards if you want. So I'm going to pull this thermostat housing because it makes it a whole lot easier. And that thermostat housing is 3 12mm nuts. And it is a lot easier to take these off if you pull the hose off of this assembly, but I'm used to doing it this way, so. And in a perfect world, you should end up with a thermostat with a gasket around it, and you should replace this thermostat and gasket when you have this assembly apart. In this particular case, he's already done this because he did the timing belt on this engine not long ago, and so we're just going to set this out of the way. And I am going to step over here for a second and grab some rags. I'm stepping in a little bit of coolant, and so I'm slipping around with my feet. Okay, so there's some rags. Now we're going to get a 14mm wrench. And at this point, for those of you that are I don't really know how to say it, but anyway, make sure you look at the fan belt and look at where the routing is. And the way I like to do this is I like to look at the pulley to the left, pulleys on the right. This one goes up and over the top, so the entire top is just a TP. And then it goes around the air conditioning, around the idler pulley. This is not a water pump right here, this is an idler pulley. It goes around that idler pulley, around the crankshaft, around the tensioner that we're going to change, and then around the alternator. So if you need to reference this when you go to put it back together, just go back to this point in the video and notice that it goes around, over the top as a TP, under, up and over, down and around, up and over, down and back to where we started. So the reason why we're changing this is because if you look, this fan belt, I can just, there's no tension on this thing. I can just pull the fan belt out really easy. So put a 14mm wrench on the front of the nut for the tensioner assembly, and you're going to push towards the ground or to your left, and it's going to release the tension on the belt. Find a good spot to pull it off. I like to do it on this pulley right here, which is the idler, the top idler. Just pull that off and let the belt fall, and then release your tension on your tensioner. And now your belt is off. So now that we've already addressed exactly how the belt routing is done, if my wife takes a step back, I cheat and I take the fan belt the way I take it off, the direction I take it off, I hold it and I come over and I just put it on the mirror. It's a good place to hang it, and when it goes back on, it's going to go back on in the same rotational direction I took it off. So now we're getting down to the nitty gritty, and what we need to do is to get this pulley off, we need to pull this cam cover, the power steering pump, the alternator, and then this splash shield for the timing belt assembly, and this idler pulley here. I am going to take the pulley for the idler, the main idler, which is, like I said, it looks like a water pump, but it's not. And this is a good time for you guys to spin all these pulleys, okay? And like this one, can you hear it? That's the one we're changing anyway. That's got a bad bearing in it. So if you hear noise out of the bearing when you're spinning it, probably a good idea to change that bearing. Okay, so the other two seem fine. All right, so what we're going to do right now is we don't want to break the vacuum lines. There's these two vacuum ports right here. You might have to come straight down. Maybe we can switch positions, right? See where my finger's at? You have to be careful that the screen doesn't flip if you go upside down. Yeah, go over here, because if you flip the camera, if you angle it any further down, it's going to flip the screen, and then we're going to be videotaping upside down. So right here, I'm going to wait until my wife figures out where she needs to be with the camera. But there's two clamps for two vacuum lines. They're just squeeze clamps. You can push them and pull them off, and then just carefully wiggle the hoses without breaking off the plastic nipples. There's two of these. Now the one that you can pop off is going to go to your right. And then the one that you can't pop off, or I'm sorry, to your left. It really doesn't matter if you get these backwards, because all it is a circuit that opens up and just allows a vacuum to go through. But if you want to put them back on exactly the same way, it's best to mark them. In this particular case, it's going to go back on the way it came off. So I'm going to pop these out of here and just get that out of the way. So now the next step, we're going to switch again because, well, you got a good view from there?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we're going to do now is there's three 14mm nuts. So I'm going to take a 14mm deep socket and a 2.5 3-inch 3/8 extension. And there's 4 holes in your pulley for your power steering. So get the top one should be a stud, so you're going to be pulling a nut off, a 14mm head nut. And then the next two, one of them is at 3 o'clock, which is this one here. And you'll notice I'll pull it out. It's a bolt, 12mm head, or I'm sorry, 14mm head. And then the next one is going to be down at 6 o'clock. And it is also a bolt, not a stud. And if you just reach back up in there with your fingers and pull on it, it should pop through. And then you can put it up in your tray. Now, the power steering pump on most of these vehicles does not want to pull forward off of this top stud without stretching all of the hoses and lines. So rather than take a chance of breaking any of that, here's where that little bitty E8 comes into play. My itsy bitsy little E8 inverted Torx. So what I'm going to do, you want to come around here and see if you can shoot over my left shoulder? You can go in like right there. So what I'm going to do is I need to get onto this stud. Can you zoom in with the zoom feature? Oops. Rookies. It's over here. It's behind the box to you right now. Can you see the bolt?
Oh, yeah, no, I can.
Okay. So sorry about that. We're just trying to get you as good a coverage on what I'm doing as possible. So hopefully these studs aren't in so tight that you can't get them off. But what you're going to be looking at is I'm removing that stud. So it's basically a bolt. It's got an E8 Torx on the front of it. And put that up there and that one. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this power steering pump and I'm just going to let it kind of flop around in here, okay? Now on the alternator, I'm not going to be able to show you the bottom bolt, but you'll be able to see it down here where my finger's at. But there's a 14 millimeter bolt down here, there's a 12 millimeter nut right here, and there's a 14 millimeter nut right here. Those three have to come out to remove the alternator. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off the smallest one, which is the side nut right here, the 12 millimeter. And I'm going to remove that 12 millimeter nut and set that up there. And then I'm going to switch my 12 millimeter socket for my 14 millimeter socket. And I'm going to take off this top nut. And then I'm going to take off this bottom bolt, which is on the lower right hand corner. It's at about 5 o'clock if you're looking at the alternator from the front. So 12 o'clock would be the top of the alternator, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's right around 5 o'clock is where you'll find that. So you'll notice the way I staggered my bolts. I have the stud and the 2 bolts for the power steering pump. And then I've got the 2 nuts and the bolt for the alternator. That just helps me remember which bolt came out of which hole. I don't have to worry about messing them up because they can be different lengths. Okay, so once that's done, what I want you to do is lift up the power steering pump with one hand, grab the pulley on the alternator, and just kind of wiggle it forward until it comes off the top stud, and just let it sit right down on the front of the chassis. Okay, the alternator is just going to sit right on top of a couple of hoses in the frame, and it's not going to go anywhere. Why don't you come around, because it's really difficult for you to get a good view of what I'm doing from there. See? So here's the alternator and the power steering pump, and they're both now out of the way. So now we're going to take the cover for the what would be considered the right side of the engine, even though we're looking at it from the left. I'm going to need a 10 millimeter. I use a deep socket. You don't need one, but that's what I use. And there is 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts that hold this cover on. So one nut, it's actually 3 bolts in a nut. So the nut is that little round nut right there. Okay. And then there is a bolt at 1 o'clock. There is a bolt at 9 o'clock. Okay. And then there is a bolt down here underneath at about 6 o'clock. Actually more like 5:30, but once that's done, you can lift this out of the way. At this point, now's a good time, if you haven't had a timing belt done, it's a good time to check your belt. Make sure that you don't have excessive slop in it. It should be nice and tight like that. It shouldn't flop around. If it's flopping around a lot, it means your tensioner is bad. Okay, now we need to pull 2 12 millimeter bolts out of the cover. Once again, I'm going to use my 3/8 impact, electric impact with the 12 millimeter. The first bolt, okay, so we had a technical, I ran out of data and we had to switch over, so now I'm going to have to splice this video together. But I'm going to take this long 12 millimeter out. Okay, and then there's another one right down here. There's only 2 of them that hold this little dust shield is what it is. And I'll make it easy on you and I'll pull, you don't really have to take this off, but I'll make it so that you can see better. So I'll take the tensioner pulley off. So now you can see what I'm working on. I don't want to set that on this paint. So this little plastic dust shield is what we're taking off, because it is pinning the tensioner assembly in. So we're just going to set that down. Now the only thing left holding this tensioner assembly in is 3 bolts, and they are all 12 millimeter. So we're going to take this nut off, this nut off, and then there is a nut or bolt down here on the left hand side. You'll see it as it comes out. It's the only other one down there. Okay, it's the same size as those, so we can set them side by side. And then you grab your tensioner and slide it off. That's a good idea to remember where the orientation of this is. So you want the L to face up. There's an L on both sides, but the Toyota sign with the 2 bolt holes is going to go at about 2 o'clock. So this is the tensioner assembly that I've seen some pretty wild videos already on some of the hard labor to get these out. Make sure you buy a good quality part. For those of you that know, I like to use OEM or at least equivalent stuff. That does not mean that if you buy it from some hole-in-the-wall part store, I won't mention any names like I did earlier. This is an awful lot of work to have to change this. You know, those parts houses, they might give you a lifetime warranty on the part. They don't tell you how many times in your lifetime you're going to have to replace it. So let's pretend this says Toyota right there. There's our L. We're going to take this. We're going to, this big stud that's sticking out right there, not the one down here, we're going to take and put the top left hole on that. And then there's 2 studs right here. Ooh, one of them came loose. So whoever put this timing belt assembly in here didn't get that all the way tight. Where'd my 12 millimeter go? 10, 13, here it is. So there's a stud right here, and it's not tight. So I'm going to tighten it up for him. All right, set that back up there. All right, so now slide those back in there. Take one of the nuts and spin it on as far as we can get it to go by hand. One of the next nuts. Now we're not going to put this thing all the way back together, but I'm going to put it back together to the point where I've got some secrets for you that'll help you out. Nothing's major. So we're going to take the bolt, all right, and we're going to put it back down here in its little bracket hole. One nut, 2 nuts, and then that. And then I'm going to take a ratchet and check the torque on these. I don't like to rattle them really hard with an electric because I want to make sure that they're nice and tight. So that's done. Hear how nice and quiet that is now? That's the way it's supposed to be. All right. So now that that's back on, here's one of the secrets. This little panel right here, this little dust shield, this thing's got a secret, 2 of them as a matter of fact, that will drive you crazy if you don't know that they're there. One of them is right here, and the other one is right here. So that's a little cam, little plastic cam, and that's a little plastic cam. When you go to bolt this back on, you have to make sure that this plastic cam slides in that way, and that plastic cam snaps up on top. Otherwise, when you tighten these down, this is not going to sit flush on the bracket, and you'll know what I'm talking about if you get it wrong. So put this thing back up in here. Put the rear cam in first, that little plastic cam, back inside the idler bracket, and then make sure that you get the one that's up here where my finger's at here. Can you see that? And then this thing should look like it's sitting flush. You should be sitting flush right here against the timing cover. You should be sitting flush against the new pulley housing that you just put on. And you should be sitting flush with this bracket right here. And if you are, take your two 12mm bolts, carefully get them started. Tighten those down. And then check the tightness with the regular ratchet. These are torqued to about 30 foot-pounds. If you're using a torque wrench, right around 25, 30 foot-pounds. Probably should have said that into the camera so I don't sound like I'm a mile away. But once that's on, double check and make sure you're up against the aluminum on this side, the steel plate on the backing on that side, and right there, and then you know your dust shield. If you see the dust shield warping out on either side, you know that you didn't get one of those little plastic cams locked in properly. So once that's done, now you can put your cover back on. Make sure you get your stud through the hole right there. That's probably the hardest part of getting these back on. And once those are on, or get that back on like that, just take your fingers and start one of the bolts. Start one of the other bolts. Drop one of the bolts. Excuse me. Okay, I'm back. And I reach under here. I'm doing this completely blind, but I've done it so many times I can do it, but you'll see it under there. Get that one started. And then just take your ratchet and just, these bolts you don't have to tighten down. They're not engine mount bolts. So you just get them nice and snug. And then we are going to take and put the little castle nut, or it's not really a castle nut, it's a dome nut. All right. So now that that's back in place, now the next step from here is to put your alternator back on. And to put your alternator back on, take one hand and pull your power steering pump out of the way. Grab your pulley for your alternator. Lift your alternator up. Get it on the stud, the top stud, the big one, and then line it up with the little stud on the right, and then just slide it back. Now if you see the little stud sticking through the hole on this ear, then you know you've gotten it pushed all the way back in. And at that point, put your 12mm nut back on it. Put your 14mm nut back on it. And then the 14mm bolt that we took out from the bottom of the alternator. And make sure you start these by hand. Don't just take an impact wrench and put them back in, because if you don't get the threads just right, there's take a chance of cross-threading them. But if you can get them to spin in a couple of threads by hand, then you're safe to just go ahead and give it a ratty-tat. That's about 3 ratty-tats. Then switch over to a 12mm. Tighten that down. Now the alternator's back on. Now what we're going to do, and there is no trick to this. This is just, consider it a competency test. Take your stud, put it back inside your E8, hold it with your fingers. I have to do this so I'm not blocking the camera. Get it started in that top hole, and then can you come around here and I'll try to not get in your way. So right here, this top hole on the cylinder head, this big one that's facing straight forward, that's the hole that we're going to go for this stud. And so just lift it up until you feel like you're close to that hole. And then get it started a couple of threads. Now these studs do not have to be super tight. Once they bottom out, that's all you got to do. Once that's done, I'm going to switch over to my 14mm real quick. Once that's done, take your 2 bolts, line up the hole in your pulley, take the first bolt, slide it into there, and then wiggle your power steering pump around until you get it screwed in about 2 or 3 turns. Pull it back out, put the next bolt on, and then find the hole in the bottom, wiggle it around as you're tightening that down. And then once you get that in a few threads, you can start tightening these down. Okay. And then there is a nut on the top because it's a stud instead of a bolt. Put the nut on, tighten that down. Now your power steering is all back together. Now we're going to reinstall the hoses that we popped off from earlier. Okay? So the first hose is going to go on. And pop in right there. Second hose is going to pop in right there. We're going to push that onto the nipple, squeeze these little clamps. Normally it's easier for me to get to when I don't have a camera over my shoulder. We'll get those on. Now those vacuum lines are back in place and they'll go back on the box when the box is reinstalled. At this point, we're going to put the pulley back on. Make sure that it's centered in the hole. You'll feel it bind if it's not. And then I need a 14 millimeter for that. Just right here. All right. So I got that back on. Now we're going to take our idler pulley for what you would think would be a water pump, and it's not. Water pump is actually timing belt driven on this engine. Now I'm going to show you my little trick for doing this. You can put the fan belt back on after you put the fan blade back in, but you have to kind of be a contortionist to do it. It's not that bad, but if you're low level mechanic, this is how I do it. So watch me real quick. So find yourself just a bolt that's bigger than the stud on this pulley, and you want the bolt to go on. It's not supposed to tighten down. Get yourself one of the bolts that are supposed to be on here, or nuts I should say, and tighten it down. Okay? The reason why we're doing this is because if you don't keep it tight, there's a little recess right here that's on the inside pulley that this will get bound up on. So now you don't have to move. I'm going to grab that fan belt and a 14 millimeter hand wrench, and we're going to put the belt back on right now. So remember we talked earlier about putting this fan belt back on, and we're going to make a TP, so to speak, over the top and down to the right. We're going to come up. We're going to go over what I'm going to call it a water pump pulley, but it's not a water pump pulley. We're going to go over this big idler pulley. Transmission line jumped to the inside of the belt. Imagine that. Okay. And then we're going to come up over the tensioner. Now here's the thing that's interesting. For me, you need to be on the tensioner pulley to really be able to get a wrench on the tensioner. So you have to find something that will slide on really easy that doesn't have a lip. So I'm going to put the tensioner pulley belt on first. And then I'm going to take my 14 millimeter hand wrench and I'm going to push the tensioner until it deadheads. And then I'm going to slide it up on this slick pulley right here, which looks like a water pump pulley. and then I'm going to release the tension. Now here's the key. Take your finger, and I've said this on other belt videos, take your finger and run it around the belt and make sure you're looking to make sure that it has not fallen off of any of these pulleys and that it's centered on every one. That'll ensure when you start the engine up that it doesn't just throw the belt or shred the belt later on down the line, which is entirely possible. Take that nut back off, set it back in your tray, pull your junk nut off and get rid of it because it didn't come with the vehicle. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put the fan blade back on. And putting this fan blade back on is, you have to be this is another what I like to call competency test, because you kind of got to be double jointed to get in here. So I'm going to get that nut on. And the whole idea is to not let the inside pulley move and pop out off of the little recess that it's on. So get 2 bolts started, or 2 nuts started the best you can. If you go to tighten these nuts down and you feel like it's binding before the stud starts coming through the nut, it means you don't have it lined up right. So just simply keep moving it around. If you need to move this pulley to be able to access the different bolts, here's the cheater way of doing it. Put your 14mm wrench back on your tensioner and release the tension, and now you can move this so that you can get to other studs. See that? So now I lined it up, because with my left hand and 2 fingers I can come in here and I can screw this nut onto this little stud, because that's an easy way for me to do it. Right hand on this side, just opposite of what I did with my left hand on the other side. Once that's done, simply tighten this down. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to tighten all 4 of these, but I'm going to do them in staggered formation. So I'm going to do a little bit on each side so that this pulley goes on dead straight. We don't want it to be crooked and bind up, otherwise it'll be out of round. We want to make sure that it goes nice and straight when it tightens down. If you'll feel it, if it grabs that lip a little bit on the pulley, you'll feel where it starts to get really easy with the nut. That means that it's centered itself out. Okay, so that's that. Tighten that down, tighten that down. Release the tension so I can spin this around. Tighten that one down. Tighten that one down. Okay, so that's where we're at with that. Now, the next step on this game is going to be, actually we probably should have put the thermostat housing on for those of you that don't like to do things the hard way. But we're going to put this thermostat housing back on. Make sure you got a good O-ring with a good seal. The hose is going to point straight down. Slide it on there. Get yourself one of your nuts for the thermostat housing. That on there like that. And then there's another one under here that you can't see, but I can feel. And then get your 12mm, put it back on your tool or your ratchet or whatever you're using. Make sure that this sits nice and flat and it's not bound or open on any side when you get close to being tight. Now the bottom one, like I said, is a lot easier without the hose on it. So sometimes it's best just to go ahead and put a hand wrench on it to tighten it down, because the hose is basically in the way of tightening it, getting a socket onto it. Okay, now I'm just trying to pop it back off because the hose has got it locked on. There we go. All All right, give it a nice snug. Nice snug. All right, so now that that's done, the next step is the radiator reassembly. And you don't have to move. Take your radiator with all of the extremities pointing away from you, the hoses and everything, and just slowly put it down in here. And then there are 2 slots in the frame that those little tangs that we pointed out earlier are going to drop into. It'll just sit and stay right where it's supposed to, like a good little radiator. Unless you bought one of those cheap things from the cheap parts houses, and then you're going to have 4 people hold the radiator. I'm kidding, but you'll have to have somebody hold the radiator while you put these bolts in. But I really like the way Toyota did the bracket on this because it makes it really easy. They almost always line up. So we're going to put those bolts in, and we're going to put these bolts in, these bolts back in. Okay, where did my 12mm wobbly go? Right here. So I get my little tool down in here. Tighten that down. Tighten that down. Tighten that down. Next step is going to be to reattach the hose for the coolant overflow bottle. And we're not going to put, actually, let's not attach that just yet. I forgot there's one thing we got left to do, which is put that radiator fan shroud back in. So take this, slide it down in here, move the hose out of the way, get it down in here, and then line up the 2 top holes, one on each side first. Get a bolt started. That'll really help with the bottom holes. Whatever you do, don't tighten the 2 top ones until you get the bottom ones in. If you didn't hear that, you'll know what I'm talking about when you get to that point, because you'll have to loosen them up to be able to move the cover. Okay, get that one started. This AC hose is really the only thing that gets in my way because I got these big Popeye arms that don't fit anywhere. All right. Get my 10mm back out. Tighten down. You don't want to crank these too hard and break anything. So I'm just cinching them and then tightening it down with the ratchet. At this point, most of you are probably not watching the video anymore because you're like, oh, I've got it from here. So I'm just going to really quickly put this back together so that my assistant can rest her poor little arms, because I'm sure she's tired. This is actually a relatively short video for what I did. Also, so the upper radiator hose is clamped. That's there. We're going to pull our protective shield out, and we are going to put and make sure nothing fell into this. Make sure there's no debris in there. Box faces towards the rear. Put the air box side on first, and then put the snorkel side on for the intake manifold. Line up your hose clamps so that they're facing in the direction you want them. Tighten them down. They don't have to be super tight. This one's got a little nipple that sticks through a hole in the band. So tighten that down. Get that out of the way. Get this out of the way. Okay, so now we've got the big hose, the little bitty hose, and then the side hose, which ironically has a clamp on it, but the little hoses and the big hose don't. So I never understood that, but oh well. We'll get over it. Okay, so now the only thing left to do is to put on this clamp. Be careful, remember you're tightening down on the plastic, so you don't want to go ballistic with those. Okay, get our beauty cover. Make sure everything looks like it's back on. Get both studs put through. Put the dome nuts back on. Just nice and snug. Don't over tighten them, otherwise it'll break the studs or pull the studs next time around. Put that there. All right, so at this point, the top of this is completely done. It's safe to go ahead and hook back up our negative post. Make sure you don't see a big spark. That means you didn't cross anything on the alternator. If you see a big old huge spark, you might want to check and make sure that a wire on the alternator is not touching something that's not supposed to be. In a perfect world, it'll do just like this. And then the next step from here is putting it back up into the air and reassembling the bottom side, which is the 3 hoses, the bottom radiator hose, the 2 transmission cooler lines, making sure that your drain bolt on your radiator, that when you drained it, is tightened back down. Some people pull those out and forget to put them back in and don't find out until after they go to top it off. And then refill it back up with coolant. In this particular case, this video is going to come to an end fairly shortly because this engine is going to get an oil change as well. But if you're looking at doing the tensioner pulley and you can't find any information on it, hopefully this helps you out. I'm going to put links in the description area underneath the video to the parts that I use. Subscribe to my channel. I'm going to try to shoot as many of these as I can for the customers that leave the vehicles with me, and hopefully it helps you out. Like I said, make sure you look in the description area. If there's any additional information, I'll have it down there, so there'll be a drop-down box you have to click on. Other than that, this is Ron with Mobile Fix Automotive, and I'm going to put this back up into the air, finish bolting the bottom of this up, which is pretty simple, just reverse of what we did at the beginning. So we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.